Greetings, I'm Reebee, Kavich, Girash.
And I'm Gregory Morisse, and we are pastors in the Southern New England Conference of the United Church of Christ. And we have been doing boundary awareness training together in Massachusetts for about a decade. And it's our privilege to welcome you to this boundary awareness training.
Greg, you've been in your ministry context for a while. Tell us about that.
So I started at the Plymouth Church in Framingham in 2004 as the associate pastor. And I have witnessed over 16 years a lot of different situations arise in the life of this congregation, including 6 years ago when the congregation asked me to discern a call as their senior pastor. So we moved through some of the complex boundary questions of moving from an associate position into the senior position. It's a great ministry, and I've learned a lot, and I hope to share some of that wisdom with you today. How about you, Reebee? What have you been up to?
So I've had the privilege of serving in a variety of settings and a variety of roles. I've served as a long-term associate in 2 congregations, and I served as a solo pastor for 5 years in 1 congregation, and now I'm on to a solo ministry in another congregation. I've also done some interim work. That's given me some insights around departure boundaries, as well as boundaries in terms of the solo or senior and associate roles. So I'm excited to share some of those things today.
Reebee and I are Christian pastors. We have been working with these materials in that context, reflecting on our faith and the ways in which our tradition informs our ethics and our morals. We understand, though, that these principles exist and are practical in other traditions, in other helping professions. So while we speak from our context, if you are coming from another context, we hope and trust that you will do some of that translation work so that it makes sense for you.
Now, speaking of language, we want to tell you who we're talking about when we make references to clergy and ministers. For clergy, we're talking about folks who are authorized by their denomination, pastors, ministers, chaplains, members in discernment, retired clergy also. And when we're talking about ministry professionals, that becomes a bit more broad. We talk about faith educators and music ministers. We speak about choir directors and pastoral counselors. Then there's another category that we include within some of these boundary training concepts, lay staff, who are tasked with serving the congregation in particular ways, office staff and maintenance staff. Our time today is really primarily going to focus on ministry professionals and authorized ministers, but we do know that there are many people who serve the church in a professional capacity.
We also will talk about the congregation or the church, and that is the body of people who gather together. And then we'll also talk about congregants, those members of the body, parishioners, members, church people, church folk, all those people who gather together for the ministry of the church. It is our expectation that you have read the Foundation's article that we sent to you prior to this video. We hope that you will read it and begin to understand these concepts. We invite you now to get some paper and pen for journaling and asking your questions throughout this video. We both started our ministry during the pain of clergy sex abuse scandals in the early 2000s. We witnessed both the power and the impact of those cases of misconduct on congregations and on the church throughout the Commonwealth. We have also both witnessed the consequences of clergy burnout and clergy misconduct up close. We have witnessed the damage that boundary violations inflict on churches, on congregants, and how congregations can even begin to mirror that dysfunctional behavior. Boundary violations last and linger in congregations for generations. We have seen careers end after boundary violations, and we have also witnessed people come back from some of those gray zones.
We've also developed a broader sense of boundary awareness over this decade. It's not just abuse prevention. It's about building sustainable ministry practices and caring for our own good health and the sanctity of our relationships outside of ministry contexts. So we've come to really understand boundary awareness to be valuable for so many different reasons.
We hope that this foundational video will be informative for you. We also recognize that the church has gone through an incredibly unprecedented experience with this global pandemic. So many of the foundational concepts that we will talk about today have a new resonance. They are old, but they are also in some ways very new. And we know that the changes that have been brought about by COVID-19 are going to linger for years to come.
So we can't be in person with our congregants or our colleagues right now. We can't do in-person trainings, and we're not sure how long it's going to be before we can. But we do know that we've got colleagues wanting to review the foundations of boundary awareness and colleagues who need a first introduction.
These are unprecedented times when many of us are finding that we have to reinvent a 2,000-year-old tradition. We are literally building the plane while we're in the air. We are building the canoe while we are paddling upstream.
We're busier than ever, working from home on platforms that most of us had never used before, producing content rather than sitting in church parlors, dealing with our own anxiety and that of the institution that we serve. A lot of us are also homeschooling. Now that said, it's still important to reflect on where we are and draw on those core values and principles that help us to minister.
As we have done all of this in the midst of all that we face, the key concepts of boundary awareness still apply, perhaps more so in this moment than ever before.
So let's get started. A prayer from Psalm 16. Protect me, O God, for in you I take refuge. You are my God. I find my worth in you.
Open my heart and my mind to listen and to learn. Sustain my breath when I encounter resistance.
The Holy One is my chosen portion and my cup. You hold my lot.
The boundary lines have fallen for me in pleasant places. I have a goodly heritage.
I bless the one who gives me counsel. In the night also my heart instructs me.
I keep God always before me. You are at my right hand. I shall not be moved.
Therefore my heart is glad, and my soul rejoices. My body also rests secure.
In your presence there is fullness of joy. In your right hand are pleasures forevermore. Amen.
Amen. Our first two key concepts in boundary awareness are power and vulnerability. Power is influence. It is the capacity to make changes within your environment. It is the resources that you have to choose to make those changes. And it is experienced in relationship between a clergy person and the people that they serve. Vulnerability is exposure to another person's power or to a group's power. Someone who is vulnerable is at greater risk of harm and increased susceptibility to influence. So let me tell you a story. A pastor was on the phone with a congregant. The pastor was feeling really tired and overwhelmed that day. The congregant began to tell them all of the things that were painful in their life at that moment. And the pastor finally got so tired that they just said, listen, none of this is important. You just need to suck it up. the congregant hasn't been able to go to church, that church or any church, since then.
So what I take from this story is that because of the pastor's authority, the pastor had more power and the congregant was then made more vulnerable, which is to say exposed. And that imbalance amplified the dismissive comment. It became more weighted and much more painful for the congregant.
Greg, that's absolutely right. Tell us about authority.
So authority is permission. Authority is the license that is granted to a clergy person or a ministry professional to wield that power within a specific context or arena. This consent can be formal and given. It can also be informal and earned. Let me tell you a story. In our congregation, we have two clergy people who are called. We have a senior pastor and a family life pastor. We also are blessed with a retired pastor in our congregation. Now, she is talented. She is ordained to the ministry of word and sacrament, but she knows that she is not authorized for ministry in our church. So she is very careful to check in with us often about how she is using her gifts and skills in ministry, checking in with us to make sure that we are offering and extending permission to her to use her ministry skills and her gifts. And we're grateful not only for her gifts, but for the ways in which she checks in to make sure that she's supporting and strengthening and helping the ministry of the church.
One of the ways that clergy use power is through the muting of the microphone. Whether or not it's who we have invited to be liturgist in the sanctuary or who we're muting over a live stream session online. Now, that's not an abuse of power necessarily, and it's not unethical. It's a use of power. And in fact, in many cases, it's setting a good boundary on worship, protecting the vulnerable by not letting in unauthorized speakers. But it's still a use of power that we are authorized for and that protects the vulnerable.
And that brings us to our next topic, boundary awareness. Boundaries protect the space between a professional's power and a client's vulnerability. A boundary can be thought of as a limit or a border or a guide. We'll come back to this concept often. Boundaries are not rules to follow, but the dynamic of a human relationship. And it's good for us to pay attention to these. Because clergy and ministry professionals are called to this work, we have to know what's happening beneath and within the relationships within the church. It is our job to make choices, to make those choices public, which is to say, to explain what we're doing and why, and then to be consistent across all our relationships within the church.
It's really important for us to be aware and intentional. That intentionality can be hard when we're under stress, but in fact, it's even more important to be intentional about the choices that we're making when we're under stress, because stress is when it's hard to make good decisions. So right now, if you're a visual learner, we invite you to spend the next couple of moments with the images that we're going to show you. Pause if you need longer with these images. What words or thoughts come to your mind? Keep this exercise quick and open to possibilities, but let your imagination travel in this time. We have one additional exercise we'd like for you to do in this moment. The slide that you're going to see is an analysis of power and authority and vulnerability. We invite you to pause and journal as you answer questions relating to your ministry, power, vulnerability, and authority.
These three key concepts, power and vulnerability, authority, and boundary awareness, all inform one another. They do not stand on their own, but are part of a deeper conversation. Today, we are going to introduce to you 9 applied principles.
When we start talking about these applied principles, we're really talking about choices that we make in ministerial relationships and how our power, vulnerability, and authority play out in interactions with those whom we serve. One of our great roles as authorized ministers is to be storytellers. We help people make meaning out of their lives. We proclaim values and norms. We tell stories. That's accountability. It's the ability to give account. It's about understanding and meaning. Accountability corresponds with authority. Now, responsibility is about the ability to do something. We are responsible for the content of worship, for example, but we're also responsible for helping people gain access to worship. And we're responsible for keeping people safe in worship and in all of our programming. So responsibility is the ability to respond. It's about agency, and responsibility also corresponds with power. Now, accountability returns here because we need to give an account of why we have chosen to do something. Why we have taken responsibility in a particular way. For example, why we have chosen a particular online platform or the rationale behind safety decisions that we're making.
And all of this happens in the context of relationships, of how we are knit together, tied together as members of the body. Our next applied principle is that of transference. This is one of the concepts we borrow from the world of psychological insight. Transference is one of 3 concepts: transference, countertransference, and projection. Transference is when someone works out their emotional residue with another person as though they were the person that the residue originated with. So, as clergy, as pastors, as ministry professionals, we provide a safe sanctuary for people to identify and work through some of their lives' greatest pain and greatest struggles. And sometimes they can confuse the pastor with the person with whom that struggle first began. Now, countertransference is when the pastor decides to participate in that dynamic, when the pastor counter-transfers by giving permission and participating in that transference. The third is projection, when a person outsources unresolved emotions out into the world. This one's my favorite. There are times when I look out into the world and wonder, why is everyone so angry? And when I take a moment to pause, I realize that it's my anger, it's my anxiety that I'm just witnessing out in the world. Clergy do this often when we look out to our congregations, but our congregations can do this just as often with their pastor. The important thing to pay attention to is the dynamic, the imbalance of power. It is a different thing for a congregant to project on me than it is for me with my power and authority to project on them. The weight and freight of my projection can have much more damage within the congregation and within the spiritual life of someone I'm called to serve.
So our next two applied principles are identity and role. Each and every one of us has a core identity that precedes and supersedes our role as an authorized minister. Our identity is that we are beloved children of God. This isn't limited by time or place. This isn't limited by the role that we play or the relationships that we're in. We are beloved children of God. That is always true. Our role has to do with the way that we are functioning in relationship with those that we serve. Our role is the job that we do. Our role can be also about our vocation. Our role is determined and limited by time and context. So when I am the pastor of a particular church, that is my role. I am the pastor. We have other roles beyond our authorized ministries, but that's the one that we're going to focus on in this time together. Now, let me tell you another story that might help to distinguish between identity and role. My mom got sick, and in that moment, I stepped completely out of my role, and I simply sat with her in faith, two children of God. I did not minister to others. I asked my congregation for time to attend to this family crisis, and the way that they ministered to me was to allow me to take that time completely away from my role as their pastor.
When I was early in my ministry and I was single, I would often find myself on first dates and someone would say, "I Googled you." And they would be very curious to know who I was as a pastor. And so sometimes even they would wonder if they could come to worship the next Sunday. And I had to help them understand that I wanted them to get to know me as Greg before they got to know me as Pastor Morisse. That there is a difference between who I am as an individual and the role that I play on stage in worship.
When I am with my congregants, the folks that I serve, I recognize that I have to be in role. I have to have an understanding that they are relating to me as their pastor. So I cannot choose when I am with members of my congregation to simply be Reebee. I am always Pastor Reebee when I'm interacting with congregants.
I've told Reebee this story before, but once in our deacons meeting, late at night when I was not perhaps as rested as I should have been, I told my congregation, "Well, I'm not your friend." What I was trying to do was clarify my identity and my role. My role was not to be their friend, my role was to be their pastor, but what they all heard was, "I don't like you, I'm not your friend." These are the ways in which we have to be thoughtful and careful with our words, but also educate those that we serve on the difference between who we are and the role we're asked to play.
And then that brings us to having a clear understanding about when we're in role and when we don't have to be in the pastoral role. So we get to an analysis exercise that Greg is going to introduce for us.
So we want to think about two different axes. One is when you're on and when you're off, and the other is when you're here and when you're away. So the first is when you're on and you're here. Now, in these days, here can mean a lot of different things. But we'll talk about Sunday morning worship. We'll talk about office hours, those times when you are in role, and you are available to your congregation. Now, there are also times when you are engaged actively in your ministry, but you are away from your congregation, such as study leave or a sabbatical. You are continuing to be as a minister, to develop your ministry skills and deepen your spirit, but you are apart and away from those you serve. Next, we think about those times when you are off and away, when you are not obligated to be a pastor anymore, when you can shed that skin and be free as yourself. This is vacation, or maybe a difficult moment of medical leave or family leave. This is time when you are not burdened by the obligations of your ministry, and you are also separate and away from your congregation. And the last is when you are off, but also here. Such things as a weekend when you are away from your congregation sort of in the short term, but you are available should there be a pastoral emergency. So you're off, you're not working, but you are still present. This also might be the day when you're off on your Sabbath, but you happen to encounter someone in your church in the grocery store. You are still here and present to your congregation. In each of these boxes, you have to think about what are your ministry obligations and what are the relationships that are playing out.
Our guess is that during our live and interactive time, we're going to spend a lot more conversation time on how to practice being on or off, here or away, when we're all working from home, when none of us are able to travel very far for a vacation that is truly off and away. But we also want to talk about Sabbath and self-care in general and in this time. Sabbath is a commandment. It's one of the 10 things that God asked the Hebrew people to do. And remember, they were walking a hard road through the wilderness for 40 years, and God still said, take a Sabbath, take time off. We know that when we take Sabbath time, we are honoring God and following that commandment, but we also know that when we're taking Sabbath time, our minds and our spirits rest for a moment. And when we return to work, we're able to do so with greater intentionality and balance. Sabbath is time that is deliberately set aside for rest and recreation and deepening one's relationship with God. And we need it.
This is one of those areas where boundary awareness training has been such a gift to me. One of the things I have learned from Reebee is the distinction between Sabbath, time spent with God, and self-care, which is time spent with yourself, time spent in rest and recovery for yourself and with yourself, also with your family and with your friends and with those outside of your congregation. I am one who loves to work and loves to work hard and loves to work long. And I was having a pretty well-developed Sabbath practice, but I also had to realize that I needed to set a time for self-care, for that time when I was eating a good meal, meditating for myself, doing things that were for my spiritual renewal and not in service of the congregation.
So this is another moment that we're going to invite you to journal for yourself. We have some questions that will help you assess where you are with self-care in particular. And take these as invitational. Don't criticize yourself if you can't check off every box. Instead, think about the ways in which you and your ministry may be supported and renewed if you can move further into some of these categories. So I invite you to view these slides and pause the video so that you have time to journal now.
Our next applied principle is dual relationships. A dual relationship is when you have more than one point of connection, one way in which you relate to a member in your congregation. Dual relationships are not bad. They actually can happen quite often, but they do and can create problems when expectations get confused. For example, I'm the pastor, and there are members of my congregation with whom I have a pastoral relationship. But there's a member of my congregation who is also an accountant. They have their own professional relationship to their clients. If I were to ask them to help me with my taxes, I would be inverting the power relationship. They would be now more powerful, and I would be more vulnerable. In a small area, in a small community, that may be necessary. But those roles and relationships can start to be confused when the power is shared and in some ways inverted.
So here's an example of one of my dual relationships. We had a parent night via Zoom a few weeks ago, just to check in with the parents in our congregation about how they're doing in this unusual moment. Now, I'm the parent of one of the teens in our youth group, and I am the spouse of one of the parents in our youth group. And in addition to that, I'm the pastor. So we all started talking about our experiences of parenting, and I had to realize that I was not just there to commiserate or to say, I'm going through the same thing, but to be the pastoral presence. And at one point, folks were saying that they were enjoying a glass of wine at the end of the day after the kids had gone to bed. And I held up my glass of seltzer because I've made a choice over the years not to drink with parishioners. Even over Zoom, I decided it would be a bad idea, but a glass of seltzer is a big treat for me these days. So no one quite got it when I was like, and this is what I'm having. But I wanted to maintain my understanding that I was in role, even though I was living through a dual relationship with both my spouse and with other parents in the congregation. One of our ways that we apply boundary awareness is to understand the meanings of confidentiality and mandated reporting. Now, when we talk about limited access information, we use three different terms. There's secrets. That is a promise between one person and another person never to divulge something to anyone under any circumstances. And there are moments when we need to be cautious about that because our ministerial code actually asks us to understand that there are moments when we cannot, for someone's safety, keep a secret. Secrets are often weighted and dangerous. They're an indicator of not wanting to seek the well-being of another person. I need you to keep this secret is a red flag. Confidences, on the other hand, is a covenant to tell only what someone needs to know when they need to know it to as limited a group of people as possible. And privileged communication is a legal definition that describes information that cannot be compelled even in court. For example, in some liturgical traditions, the sacrament of reconciliation falls under privileged information. Now, we're going to suggest that you spend more time on those concepts than we can today, but it then applies to our power and others' vulnerability, our authority, and our responsibility and our accountability when we think about mandated reporting or other moments in which we need to report that someone is in danger and seek help for someone who is in some specific form of danger. Mandated reporters are required by law to report if they suspect that a child is being abused. There's also a moral and ethical need to seek the safety and well-being of someone who is in danger and does not have their own ability to respond to that danger. So in those situations, we're thinking about elders and people who have disabilities. The laws vary in different states. In Massachusetts, there are mandated reporters of elder abuse, but that category does not include clergy. However, I would say that we may be morally mandated to take action. We invite you to look at the laws of your location to make sure that you have a clear understanding of both your legal obligation and your moral and ethical obligations with this.
Our next two applied principles come from the discipline of family systems theory. Family systems theory is both psychological wisdom, but also spiritual. The first concept is self-differentiation. This is the emotional process by which a leader understands themselves in their distinctive role within the community, within the system, be that your family, your congregation, or your denomination. Self-differentiation is how we understand that we are different and how we take responsibility for defining our roles and making our choices. Self-differentiation helps us to know that we are the pastor called by God, set apart for a ministry of word and sacrament. We are not called to be people's friends. We are not asked to be grandchildren or brothers or sisters. We are different, set apart from those we serve. The next concept is triangles. Triangles are the basic building block in physics as well as in human relationships. Triangles form to stabilize human interactions. If two people are in relationship, there is often a third party. It might be a person, it might be a group of people, it might be an idea that hold those two people into a stable pattern. Now, as clergy, we are often engaged in congregations in which we are participating in multiple triangles. That's the system. If you look at the Eiffel Tower, it's made of all kinds of intersecting triangles that build the structure. The church is the same way. One of our rules to remember, and this comes from the wisdom of Ed Friedman, stay on your side of the triangle. If perhaps two members of your congregation are at odds, perhaps on where somebody should stand in your sanctuary to hand out bulletins on a Sunday morning, their conflict could be stabilized if you decide you're going to jump in and solve it. Instead of jumping into a relationship that you're not a part of, instead of jumping into an argument that you're not a part of, stay in relationship with each individual. Coach them, guide them, pastor them to be the best person that they can be so that they can manage their relationships on their own. When we interact and interrupt other people's relationships, we take on their anxiety and stress, and nobody needs extra anxiety and stress in their lives. At this time, we suggest that you pause this video and take some time to journal, to reflect on what you have observed, what has come up for you, what are some of the ideas and thoughts and wonderings that have begun to percolate within you.
Grace is core to our faith. The idea that we can ask for forgiveness and move on is core to our faith. We are beloved children of God, and that's true whether we are just ourselves or in our roles as pastors and authorized ministers. We will make mistakes. We are not perfect. We are not God. But God's grace and love are available to us, and we can always recognize what's going on, make a new choice, make reparations for what we have done, and move forward in relationship. Amen. None of us are being our best selves right this second. So let's accept that and work to do as well as we can.
As we said earlier, it is the obligation, the responsibility of pastors to be intentional in their choices. So we encourage you to think deeply about these key concepts and applied principles, wonder about them, study them, research them, and apply them to your ministries. That intentionality is so critically important. And then be transparent. As I said earlier, make choices and then make those choices public and be consistent. Be consistent in your ministries, whether it is Easter Sunday morning and you are greeting a large congregation, or if it is in the middle of a global pandemic and you greet everyone digitally. Every moment in ministry asks and expects the pastor to be faithful to our call and to our ministerial code.
Now, speaking of being intentional, Greg, I am telling my folks that even though I can't go anywhere, I'm taking self-care and study time next week. I'm doing some reading, I'm ignoring some emails, I'm watching a continuing education conference that has been moved online. I am trying to take that Sabbath and self-care time in the midst.
That's awesome. One of the things that we have worked on, I've been with my congregation for almost 16 years, and I have trained them to know that Friday is my Sabbath. But as soon as this pandemic happened, that no longer worked. My schedule as it had been no longer made sense. I had to reorganize my life. And so I've been very clear to communicate with the congregation when I am taking time for myself, when I am holding a Sabbath. It started off that I was taking some of that time on Saturdays, then it was Mondays. It's shifted and changed. And so I'm constantly making an intentional choice in the week and communicating that out to the congregation so that they know when they can reach me and when I'm available for pastoral support or for business of the church.
We're so glad that you have joined us, and we're looking forward to being with you for an interactive session applying the foundations of boundary awareness to this moment of global pandemic.
We have available to you in the coming years other modules where we will focus on specific topics. Those include clergy with spouses and or children, digital ministry, Sabbath and self-care, single clergy, politics, retirement and clergy departures, and faith educators and music ministers. We can't cover all of that, but if there are any specific topics from that material, from those areas that might be of particular pressing urgency in this time, we encourage you to email us your questions. What are you experiencing? How are you holding up? What are the boundaries that are difficult to maintain, confusing to identify, or you just don't know how to navigate?
If you'd like more resources that we think are of great value to you in your boundary awareness journey, we invite you first to start with the United Church of Christ. Take a look at the 2018 Manual on Ministry. Find the UCC Ministerial Code that is part of that. Find also the 2018 updated ordination vows. These will help you to ask good questions about authorized ministry and our moral and ethical obligations in boundary awareness. We also want to commend to your attention A Failure of Nerve by Edwin Friedman, Leaders Who Last by Margaret Mercuson, Rest in the Storm by Kirk Byron Jones, and Healthy Disclosure, Solving Communication Quandaries in Congregations by Kibby Simmons Ruth and Karen McClintock. All of these resources are worth the time that you will put into reading them and absorbing their wisdom.
Thank you so much for being here. We are glad and humbled that you have taken this time to study and reflect. We look forward to meeting with you on our live interactive session where we can dialogue and explore one another's questions. We close now with a reading and a prayer.
From the Gospel of Luke, chapter 12, verse 48. From everyone to whom much has been given, much will be required. And from one to whom much has been entrusted, even more will be demanded.
Will you join me in prayer? God, you are the Alpha and Omega, the beginning and end, and our beginning and end. Retune our senses to perceive our power and recalibrate our spirits to honor the authority we receive. Afford us the strength and focus to dive deeper still. Amen.
Amen. Go in peace.
Go in peace.